Ayan. So again, good afternoon. Please be informed that this session is being recorded and later on will be posted in our YouTube channel. So this will also serve as your reviewer for your incoming summative test number 2. So last time we have discussed the functions, nature, history of accounting, its concepts, and principles. So today we're going to discuss naman the accounting equation and the 5 major accounts. So the basic accounting equation class is assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. So pag sinabi nating asset, so usually it represents on what the company owns. Okay, so on the other hand naman, which is the right side, liabilities plus equity, it represents those that the company owes. So kaya nga ganyan equation, meaning to say, if you're going to add your liabilities and equity, the total should be, or it should be equal to your total assets. Okay, so sabi nga, yung asset is what the company owns. So ano ba yun? Ano ba yung mga yun? So these are resources that the entity controls in order to attain future benefits. Okay? On the other hand, the right side represents the claims of different parties to the company's assets. So liabilities is the claims of the entity's creditors, while the equity represents the residual interest of the owners. Okay? So also remember that just like in any equation, the two sides of the equation should always be balanced. Hence, what the company owns should always equal to what it owes to its owners. So one of the elements of the accounting equation again is the assets. So sabi nga, tandaan, take note, assets are resources that the entity owns. So these are usually used by the company in its normal operations, such as the manufacture of goods or delivery of services. So the main feature of this asset is, of course, the capability to give benefits to the entity. So these benefits are usually in the form of their ability to directly or indirectly increase the inflow of cash to the entity or reduction of its its outflows. Okay, so ano ba yung mga example ng assets? So marami po yan. We have cash, account receivable, inventory, equipment, land and building, intangible assets. So marami pa po yung breakdown na later on mas makikilala niyo pa, such as prepaid rent or prepaid interest, furniture and fixtures. Ayan. So usually asset is subdivided also into current and non-current assets. So the difference between the two is when you say, when you're talking about the current asset, it is easily converted into cash. While if you're talking about non-current assets, of course, medyo matagal yung pag-convert natin into cash. So for example, cash, we all know what cash is. Generally, it is the money that we use, comprising of the bills and coins we use in our everyday lives in order to buy the goods that we want and also obey the services that we need. However, when accounting for cash, we also consider cash as the money that is deposited in the banks and even undeposited checks from customers. So sa cash pa lang, general pa lang yan. But actually, we have different types of cash. Okay? We have cash on hand. These are usually the cash you have on your hand. Cash in bank, usually these are the cash deposited in your bank. And meron din tayong tinatawag na cash in transit. Okay? Yung papunta pa lang sa'yo. Okay? So accounts receivable naman represents amounts that are collectible from customers. They arise when a business sells its good or services on account or on credit. Take note kasi, please memorize this. Okay? Actually, yung accounting equation na yan, pinaka-basic na yung asset equals liabilities. and owner's equity. Pag in-expand natin yan, dito na naman introduce yung 5 major accounts, okay, which is asset, liability, capital, expenses, and revenue. These are the 5 major accounts. So as an accounting student or as an ABM student, you should be able to memorize what are those accounting titles. Pag sinabi ko accounting titles, ito po yun. Okay, these are the cash, accounts receivables, etc. So what are the accounting titles under assets? So this is one of the major accounts. Okay. So for example natin sa accounts receivable, no? So you render a services. When you render a services and the customer did not pay you, then meaning to say you have an accounts receivable. Okay? And the customer has an account payable. Usually sila yung sila yung magka-tandem lagi. And make sure din also to be aware kung what point of view ba ang sinasabi natin. Okay? Pag ikaw yung nag-render ng services, hindi nagbayad si customer, so sa book of account mo, ibig sabihin meron kang accounts receivable or meron ka pang matatanggap sa customer mo. Sa book of account ng customer mo, dahil hindi pa siya nakakapagbayad, ibig sabihin meron pa siyang accounts payable. Okay? So mas mauunawaan niyo po na niyo pa itong different accounting title if we pursue or if we proceed to doing the journal entry. Okay? Pero later pa yon. Kaya please memorize. Next is assets. Another assets is the inventories. If you go to sari-sari store, you will notice piles of assorted products being offered for sale. So chances are you may easily find various items that you need or want, such as food and household items, such as products are normally owned with the sari-sari store, and these products are inventory, which are normally held for sale by the store and its normal operation. Ayan. So remember na discuss ko last time yung different forms of business organization and nature of business. So sa different forms, we have the sole proprietorship, partnership, corporation, and cooperative, right? And I discussed the advantages and disadvantages. Tama? So under the nature of business, we have what we call service business, wherein you offer, na-discuss ko rin to, your services. Then the second one is the merchandising business, where you buy and sell the products. So if you're going to do the financial statements, the income statement, etc., or if you're looking for an accounting title that is suitable to use in that kind of transaction, you use the word inventories. Okay? Kasi you buy and sell a product. Nakuha ba? Okay. So anyway, equipment. So for example, pandesal shops would need ovens and furnaces in order to properly and actually create their goods. So the product of these ovens are the pandesals, which would be sold later on and eventually increase the cash of the shop. So equipment. For example, another business, if you want to have a restaurant, what equipment ang kailangan mong bilhin na kakailanganin mo sa business mo? So usually, pag sinabing equipment, these are things na sinasaksak. Okay? So mga equipment, it can be big, pero hindi naman sa lahat ng bagay na na sinasaksak ha. Kasi iba rin yung supplies na tinatawag. Okay? So pag supplies, usually ito yung nauubos ka agad. Mga for example, papel, ballpen. So kung restaurant ang business mo, yung supply siguro ninyo is mga paper cups, mga ganon. So if you're talking about equipment, tapos ang business nyo is restaurant, so siguro you have a blender, you have a computer, if you have the point of sale machine, okay? Or you can have an espresso, that is an equipment. You can have a refrigerator, that is also an equipment. Okay? So yun po yung equipment. It really depends on what type of business ang ino-offer mo. So for example, in our case, we have a bakery. Our equipment is dough roller, oven, mga ganon. Okay? Blender. So that are our equipment. So another assets is the land and building. Okay? So there are times na pag sinabi mong land, of course, that is the lot na pinagpatatayuan ng business mo. So it can be rented or it can be owned. So the building, of course, yun yung pinatayo mo sa land. There's a possibility na sa'yo ang building pero hindi sa'yo ang land. Just like the Jollibee. Di ba? Hindi sa kanila ang land, pero sa kanila ang building. Sila nagpatayo. Parang may contract lang sila ng owner. Si Hilson, ano bang tawag? Hilson? Basta mga ganun ang tunog yata ng owner. No? Okay? So anyway, in most businesses, a physical store is necessary for them to operate. So for example, how can a local karinderya function without an actual store? So kung siguro kung nag-e-entrep kayo, these are your booth. Okay? Yung building na tayo nyo. Tapos kunwari kung sa MNHS kayo nagpatayo, so yung land ninyo is yung MNHS. Okay? So where there'll be a barbershop operate without its buildings, such buildings are also assets of the businesses. So usually, yung land and building class, no, these are actually belong to the non-current assets. Kasi pag binenta mo kasi ito or niliquidate mo, it takes time. So yung mga cash and accounts receivable, they belong to current assets. Okay? So anyway, ma-discuss pa naman to further. If not here in your FAB1, maybe in your FAB2, but at least you have an idea. Then we also have what you call intangible assets. So pag sinabing intangible, hindi po siya nahahawakang asset. So when we think of things we can own, we normally think of tangible things or nahahawakan, or those that can be seen and touched. However, assets also encompasses intangible things that can neither be seen nor touched. So for example, the software used by computer shops are actually assets that they own. So for example, if you play ML, the account of your account in your ML is actually one of the tangible assets because you can sell that account. Diba? Merong mga ganon, lalo na kung ano ka na, kung mythic na yung mga character mo, mga ganon. So, ano na, pwede mo siyang ibenta kasi may mga addict na bumibili ng mga ganon. Okay? So, for example, nung mga kapanahang addict din kami ng mag-asawang maglaro doon ng MU, especially yung asawa ko. Yun, bumibili kami ng, siya lang pala, bumibili siya ng Jewel of Bless. Bumili yata siya ng Jewel of Bless, halagang 3.5 noon, para lang ma-upgrade yung, ma-upgrade lang yung armor. Okay? So, yung mga axi na yan is also an example of an intangible assets. Also load. It also an intangible asset. So kapag kapag yung mga bonds is also an intangible assets. Okay, so marami pa po. You can search the web on what different assets pa or accounting title na pwede ninyong magamit. Okay, tandaan nyo rin to kasi magagamit sa marketing, which is magkakaroon na kayo by next week. Okay. What else? Yeah. So, liabilities. So, pag sinabi mong liabilities, usually ito yung mga obligations mo na kailangan bayaran. Ito yung mga utang mo na kailangan mong bayaran. Okay? So, of course, these are one of the claims of external parties from the entity. Basically, they are the debts of the entity to external creditors. So, these debts do not always have to be paid in money. Remember, we have what we call credit card. Okay? Some of these liabilities are in the form of obligations to do some service or even give something. So usually, kapag liability siya, meron siyang word na payable. Okay? Pero meron ding liability, for example, yung accrued income na tinatawag. Income lang nakalagay pero actually it is a liability. Why? Kasi para siyang nabayaran na siya ng customer pero hindi mo pa nare-render yung services. Okay? So, that's why it is a liability. Okay? Kung baga may utang ka pa na i-render sa customer mo. Okay? What else? Can you think of another liability? So if you pay in notes, you have promissory notes. So ang tawag naman doon is notes payable. So anyway, ito na yung different kinds of liability. So of course, the accounts payable, nabanggit ko na to kanina, di ba? Sa accounts receivable, usually sila yung magkatandem. So sa point of view ko, kung ako yung may utang, meron pa akong accounts payable. Nakuha? Ayan. Unearned revenue or unearned income. Ito naman yung sinasabi ko. So for example, telecommunication companies, lalo na kung ito ay postpaid. Telecommunication companies such as Globe and Smart normally offer prepaid loads to customers. These load credits can be later on or used by customers for text services or to call other people. On the other hand, when Globe or Smart receive payments from their customers, it creates an obligation for them to actually deliver their services. Such obligations give their service are recorded as liability. Kasi nag-load si customer pero hindi pa niya nagagamit yung load niya. Ibig sabihin sa telecommunication such as Globe and Smart is obligated or meron pa siyang unearned revenue sa customer. So once na nagamit na ni customer, iba naman na ang tawag dan. Magre-reverse na yan. Okay? Familiarity pa lang tayo ng mga accounting title class ha. And sabi ko nga, there are still a lot of accounting titles available. So hopefully mabitbit ko din yung aking notes sa different accounting titles. Nang sa ganun, you can screenshot it, etc. Notes ko pa yata yun ng college ako. Okay? Anyway. So the elements of accounting equation. The other elements after the liability is of course the equity. So usually meron tayong financial statement that is called changes in owner's equity. Okay? So pag sinabing equity, it reflects the residual claims or net assets of the owners of the entity. This is similar to the net worth part of the SALN or the public servant. So take note that these are only residual claims of the owners since the creditors get their share of the entity first before the owners are given their share. This is also why the net worth of individuals is computed by subtracting their liabilities from their assets. So usually, ang involved dito sa equity is meron siyang capital, meron siyang withdrawal, tapos yung net income or net loss. So usually, yun yung involved dito sa paggawa ng equity. Okay? Ayan na. Ito pala yung nabanggit ko. Sinabi pala dyan. So, generally, equity comes from two sources. The first one directly from the owners in the form of investment of capital. The other comes from the income of the business from its normal operations. So, the net income or net loss of the business from its operations can be determined by using the following equation. So, ito na my revenue minus expenses equals net income and net loss. So, whatever the result, it will be added to kung net income, it will be added to the capital less drawing. Pero kung net loss, it will be deducted dun sa capital. Anyway, tuturo ko rin yan sa inyo. Okay? So a business will have a net income if its revenue exceeds. Income would have a net loss if its revenues are less than its expenses. So a revenue, that is actually part of the major accounts. A business earns revenue when it sells its products or its services when you go to store and buy a phone. The store earns revenue when you get a haircut from a barber shop. The shop also earns revenue. Generally, we can say that it is the business earns revenue when it expects to earn an economic benefit in the form of an increase in assets such as cash or decrease in liabilities. Other terms used for revenues are, of course, sales if your business is a merchandising business, rent, fees, etc. Okay? So, another is yung expenses. So, nababanggit ko na yung 5 major accounts na tinatawag ko class ha. Una, assets, then liabilities, followed by capital, revenue, and expenses. So, these are the 5 major accounts na sinasabi ko. Okay? And mahalaga na alam nyo kung ano-ano yung mga accounting title associated on that 5 major accounts. Okay? So expenses. Matching principle. So ito yung nabanggit ko last time or last session, the matching principle. So matching principle states that no revenue can be earned without incurring corresponding expenditure. Such, when a store sells a phone, aside from getting cash for the phone, it also incurs costs for the goods it has sold. So on the other hand, such is also true when services are also rendered. In the barber shop, when someone gets a haircut, the barber shop incurs costs in the form of salary for its employees. In short, in a matching principle, kapag meron kang income, automatic meron kang expenses na na-incur. Nakuha? As a teacher, anong na-earn? Di ba mag-earn kami ng income kapag nagturo sa inyo? Di ba? Nag-earn. For example, I work in a public institution or even in a private institution. Public na lang. I work in a public institution. Tama? So, si DepEd, automatic, yung pinangbabayad sa aming salary, galing yan sa mga taxes ng mga parents ninyo. Or kahit sa inyo yan. Di ba? So, yun ang binabayad niya sa amin. So kapag binayaran kami ng employee namin, expenses yun sa kanila. Nakuha? So kapag nagturo kami, ibig sabihin na render namin yung services sa inyo, ibig sabihin nag-earn sila ng income. Kasi dahil naging satisfied yung mga customer namin, maraming public student ang papasok sa school namin. Okay? For example, gawin nating private. Private si Madam. Diba? Dahil magandang magturo si Madam, kunwari, maraming nainggan yung estudyante na magpa-enroll dun sa private school na yon. So in return, yung private school na yon, magkakaroon siya ng expenses kasi kailangan niyang bayaran ng sahod si Madam. Yun lang po ang simpleng explanation nitong matching principles of accounting. Okay? So ito na yon, capital. So under equity to ha, ito yung mga concerns sa under equity. So ito rin yung size sa mga 5 major accounts. So capital account of the equity represents the net investments of the business. This means that any contribution of the owner which increases the assets of the account or decreases its liability will increase the capital accounts. For example, nag-i-start ka pa lang ng business mo. Okay? So lahat ng in-invest mo, it can be equipment, it can be in cash, para makapag-start ng business mo, ang tawag dyan ay capital. Usually, sinusulat yan sa transaction. For example, ako yung nag-invest. Usually, apelyido nung kung sino man yung nag-invest. So, for example, si Bayan, capital. Noon. Okay? Yan. So, lastly, at the end of each accounting period, the net profit or loss of business is also close to this account. Ayan. So, medyo na-explain na usually yung major accounts dun eh. Bitin ko, what is the accounting equation? Assets should be equals to liabilities plus owner's equity. Under the owner's equity, we have the what? Revenue.
Revenue, expenses, capital.
Capital.
Tandaan yun ha. Yan. Now, yan, andito pala, in-explain pala yung nabanggit kanina sa accounting equation natin is the assets, right? And I also discussed that there are two kinds of assets. The current assets and non-current assets. Ano uli ang sinabi ko? Anong palatandaan nyo pag sinabing current assets? Kasi class, pwede nitong basahin, pwede yung, ang tanong, kaya nyo ba i-memorize lahat yan? Dapat mga keywords lang yung natin kasi hindi nyo ma-absorb lahat yan. Diba? Ito pwede yung balik-balikan. Pero gusto ko kasi, kaya ko gustong mag-take down notes kayo, yung mahalaga or importanteng bagay, para pa sa pag-review ninyo, madali na lang. Diba? So, current assets, it can be easily converted into cash. Meaning to say, madaling ma-liquidate within a year. Okay? Pag sinabing non-current assets, it takes time. Why? For example, yung sinasabi ko kanina, bago ko kanina, yung land. Usually, bago pa yan mabenta, minsan may mga bidding pa, marami pang aasikasuhin, may transfer of title, mga ganong bagay. Diba? So anyway, current assets, of course, are all assets which are expected to be realized within the ordinary course of business or a span of 12 months, 1 year, diba? Whichever is longer. Meaning to say, realization here only means that these assets are expected to be converted into cash, sold or disposed after a certain time or through the passage of time. So for example, cash. This is the most common or basic familiar of all the asset. Cash is generally classified as a current assets. But of course, did you know that cash not only includes money? Yan. So money means everything composed of bills and coins considered as legal tenders, such as the Philippine peso in the Philippines, of course, legal tenders of other nations such as the US dollar. Okay, so cash on the other hand also includes money in the form of bank deposits. Okay, so mga checks, okay, such as of course, checking accounts, savings account. Ito yung nabanggit ko sa inyo na ano, 'di ba? Cash in bank. Yan, ito 'yon. So it can also include checks such as those provided by customers and payment for goods and services received. Okay? So some companies would also include cash equivalents. In the cash classification, cash equivalents are short-term investments which are considered subject to negligible changes in fair value and are maturing within 3 months from the date of their purchase. So ito usually yung mga, kung nasa trading ka, medyo familiar ka nito. Ito yung mga bonds, mga ganon. Okay? Examples of this includes yung treasury bills, certificates of deposits, and money market instruments. Okay? So it is important to note that among all assets, cash is considered the most liquid, meaning to say it can be easily converted. It can easily be realized. Okay? So as reflected by its ready usability through almost all transactions a company can enter. As such, the cash account is routinely monitored through the statement of cash flow. So take note, dahil pandemic, di ba? Mako-consider mo ba na yung pera mo dun sa GCash mo, sa Paymaya mo, or sa CoinsPH mo is cash? Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so ito po yung nababanggit ha. Hindi lang literal na kasi meron tayong intangible asset, 'di ba? Hindi mo nahawakan, may cash ka doon. 'Di ba? O nag-online banking tayo o cash in bank 'yon. 'Di ba? Ayan. So another current assets is the accounts receivable. Ano nga uli ang pagkakaintindi nyo sa accounts receivable? Hello? Ang example ko.
Yung matatanggap po ng nag-render po ng
Services. Oh, very good. Anong pangalan mo, Ning?
Moreno po.
Ano?
Moreno Jeremy po.
Yan, nagja-jot down notes. Yan. Kasi pag ito na, binasa nyo na, naku, ano na nga yung sinabi ni ma'am. Anyway, accounts receivables are oral promises to the entity to receive cash or at a later date. Okay? They usually arise from the normal course of business such as selling goods or delivering services. But what? It can also come from non-trade events such as you lending your friend. Those which arise from the normal course of business are called trade receivables. And of course, take note of this one, highlight this one if you want. Those which do not are either called non-trade receivables or simply other receivables. Okay, so while they can be just as easily converted in liquid as cash, definitely not all receivables, take note of this one, not all receivables can be collected. Why? Kasi companies also set up a contra asset account na tinatawag naming allowance for doubtful accounts or bad debts allowance. Okay? So it estimates how much of their current receivables are uncollectible kasi alam naman natin na meron pong hindi nagbabayad ng kanilang utang. So these are uncollectible. Okay? So merong ina-allowance na nila yan. Okay? Kimi. Sensya na ang aking songer na anak. So yan. So another assets class is what you call the notes receivables. Okay? Notes receivables, if your customer is saying or telling you or gave you a what? A note. Meaning you are about to receive cash for a later date. Of course, with the main distinction that notes receivables are all written and hence more formal than accounts receivable. So this added formality feature ensures that in the case of default by the borrower, the company can seek additional legal remedies to recover what has been lent. So, of course, as a businessman, lalo na kung hindi nyo masyadong kilala no, yung pinapautang nyo, make sure to have a written agreement. Kasi at least kahit pa paano may habol kayo. Pero usually kung kaibigan, as alam mo namang good payer, so usually kahit accounts receivable, kahit wala nang written. But if you really want na secure, always na black and white tayo. Meaning, every time na papasok ka sa isang bagay or in a contract or in an agreement, make sure to have a written one na signed by both parties. Okay? And meron kayong witness, kung pwede pa nga, ipa-notaryo sa abogado. Okay? So, para sa ganon, you have legal remedies to recover what ever na pinahiram mo. Kasi pwedeng, lalo na kung, kung verbal agreement lang, tapos pwede niyang itanggi. Hearsay, hindi naman ako nang hiram. Uy, nagbayad na ako, ganyan. Same as kung ano yung na-receive. So, ganun din, no? For example, kahit hindi sa akin. So, kapag may ipinapasa kayo sa akin man, sa mga subject teacher ninyo, it applies to all. May pinasa kayong output, make sure to have a copy. Always a receiving copy. Okay? Na, ma'am, papirma po, ito po yung pinasa. Nagpasa ako sa inyo ng ganito, ganyan. Pag sinabing nawala akong ganyan, wala pa akong pinasang ganun, etc. You have your, what do you call this? You have your proof. Okay? Pwede nyo i-contest. Okay? Anyway, may katanungan ba at the moment? Hindi ko rin po pala nakikita dito yung time class, so I hope hindi ako mag-overtime sa inyo. Okay? Anyway, another current assets is the inventory. So as you look at a sari-sari store across the street, you see a lot of items hanging displayed. So these are what you call inventory. Okay? These are called inventory in accounting parlance. And aside from these finished goods which are available for sale, inventory also includes raw materials, work in process items, and supplies. Okay? So if manufacturing ang business mo, inventory can be your raw materials or work in process and supplies. Pag buy and sell, inventory yung mga natitirang finished goods mo. Okay? So more raw materials are basically inputs for producing other materials. So for example, if your business is a banana queue, as what you have learned in your business math, your raw materials are Ano, kung banana Q ang business nyo? I think first lesson yun. O, ano, banana,
Stick,
stick,
sugar,
sugar,
mantika po.
mantika. Ayan. So, yung iba, yung iba such as the plastic na packaging, such as the gasoline, ay part na yon ng operating cost. Okay? Naalala niyo yung inyong businessman. So 6 is the prepayments. When you're talking about prepayments, these are advance payments of your customers class. So for example, if someone paid you an interest in advance, that is a prepaid interest. For example, if you paid rent in advance, that's what you call prepaid rent. If you're paying for salaries in advance, prepaid salaries. If you paid for insurance, prepaid insurance. Okay? You just put prepaid. Nakuha? So, once na-incur mo na yung advance payment mo, for example, prepaid rent, di ba? Kunwari, nagbayad ka ng 12,000 as rent for the whole year. January pa lang. Pagpatak ng January 1 at na-incur mo na up to January 30 yung services, ibig sabihin, nabawasan na yung prepaid rent mo. Naging 11,000 na lang. Kasi meron ka ng prepaid, hindi pala prepaid expense, rent expense. Kasi na-incur mo na eh. I hope nagigets nyo yung idea pag sinabing prepayments. Okay? Hindi ko na hahabaan yan. Pwede na kayo magbasa dyan. Okay? So, tandaan, those are the current assets. Ano uli-uli? Ano uli ang current assets? Cash, accounts receivable,
account receivable, note receivable,
Short-term
inventory, and
investment.
payment.
pero 6 lang yan. Pero kumbaga marami pa yung mga under. Okay? Pwede nyo yung kumbaga himay-himayin pa. So sa 6 na yan. So yung notes receivable, under lang din yun sa accounts receivable. Ay, hindi pala. Okay ba? Notes receivable, inventories, and prepayment. So these are the current assets. And next naman is the non-current. So usually may dash yan class ha, yung non-current, tapos dash current assets. Okay? So pag sinabing non-current assets, kung kanina within a span of 12 months or 1 year, ito usually medyo mas matagal. Okay? So lahat ng hindi nabanggit natin na easily converted into cash or hindi natin nabanggit na assets sa current assets, lahat po ay nagfo-fall na sa non-current assets. And take note that they necessarily do not need to have at least 12 months remaining before the expected realization. As long as they do not meet the current asset classification, they are classified as here. Take note ha, lahat ng criteria ng current assets, kung hindi nami-meet nung accounting title na yon, it means belong siya sa non-current assets. Okay? So one example, of course, is investments. Okay? So perhaps the most liquid of the non-current assets, the investments account, include all the company's investment which it does not expect to realize within 1 year. So different from the short-term investments account, which usually include only highly liquid investments such as bonds and stocks. So the investment account here can also include other forms of investment such as real estate, long-term notes, government treasury bills, and funds set aside for long-term purposes. Lahat ng asset na hindi mo marirealize within 12 months, dito na magfo-fall. Okay? So kung investment yan na hindi mo marirealize within a year, non-current assets na yan. And use, okay, sa preparation na lang ng financial statements. Pero sige, heads up na lang. So sa preparation kasi of financial statements, usually sa statement of financial position, the arrangement is according to the realization of that certain accounting title. So usually nauuna yung mga current assets followed by non-current assets. Okay? So hindi siya naka-alphabetically arranged. Okay? Next is the fixed assets. So pag sinabing fixed assets, usually kung ano yung, for example, internet, no? Kung ano yung bill mo ng internet ng January, ganun din yung bill mo ng February. Kumbaga naka-fix siya. Anyway, so fixed assets are what can be called as the most tangible, longest-serving assets to a company can have. They are expected to not be converted into cash immediately and are regularly placed as means of productions. For example, fixed assets are land improvements, building, machineries, equipment, furniture, and fixtures, land improvements. Collectively, they can also be called as property, plant, and equipment, or PPE. Okay? So sila yung mahirap, di ba, na i-convert ka agad. Naka-fix na siya. Okay? So unlike current assets, they are not usually consumable and are only used through utilization. So ang cash flow usually ng non-current assets medyo matagal. Okay? Ganun ang isa sa mga characteristics ng non-current. And kapag current naman, ito yung mabilisan. Diba? Okay. So fixed assets with the exception of land also gradually deteriorate with the passage of time. So for example, another current asset is car. Remember na meron silang nagde-depreciate po sila. Kaya nagkakaroon ng depreciation expense. Kasi through time, paglabas mo pa nga lang class ng kotse o ng sasakyan doon sa mismong pinagbilhan mong store, automatic its value is being depreciated. Okay? So sa lahat lang, kaya kung kayo ay mag-invest, make sure to invest on land. Kasi the more na tumatagal, the more na tumataas ang value. Samantalang kung house, kaya nga minsan mapapaisip ka paano in our lesson, sinasabi natin na ay ang bahay asset siya. But kung iisipin mo talaga, masasabi mo lang actually na asset ang bahay kung may choice between nagrerenta ka o titira ka sa nirerentahan mong bahay or sa sarili mo ng bahay. Or masasabi mo lang talaga na asset yung bahay mo kung nagpaparenta ka din. Kasi at least nag-earn ka ng income. Kasi usually kung hindi, dead end ang bahay kasi kailangan mo siyang more on expenses kailangan mo siyang i-maintain, etc. Same as car. Magiging matatawag mo lang, dito sinasabi natin na ang car is part of an asset, di ba? Pero kung iisipin niyo talaga, di ba class, in reality, ang car pag hindi mo ginamit, it can be your liability. Why? Kasi gumagastos ka for maintenance, gumagastos ka for registration, ganon. But if ever na nag-earn ng income yung car mo kasi ginagamit mo siya for delivery, for your job, di ba? So, it can be an asset. Pero dito, asset siya. So, I'm talking about in a business point of view. Di ba? Kung marirealize mo nga naman. Kaya kung ikaw, anong pipiliin mo? Bibili ba ako ng sasakyan? Bibili ba ako ng lupa? So, ganon. Okay? Anyway, unlike current assets, sabi ko nga, except sa land, lahat po yun ay nagde-deteriorate, nagde-depreciate. Okay? So, such deterioration is more properly termed as, of course, yung sinasabi ko kanina pa, depreciation. It is a form of an expense. On a personal level, your mobile phones, laptops, and other gadgets can be considered as your fixed assets. So another non-current assets is, of course, intangible assets. So kanina meron din tayong di ba, current na intangible. So in contrast to fixed assets, intangible assets lack physical substance. Hindi mo sila mahawakan, and yet are similarly realizable over long period of time. Being intangible, it is harder to measure their value and evaluate them as assets compared to tangible assets. So prime examples include patents, copyright, franchises, goodwill, trademarks, and licenses. Often they are simply presented by a written document or certificate stating the description and ownership status. So over time, the value of most intangible assets would likewise decrease, hence similar to fixed assets. Intangible assets are also subject to some form of course of depreciation, which is more appropriately called as amortization. Okay? So I hope nauunawaan ninyo ha. And of course, another is other assets. So whatever it is na hindi nag-fall sa non-current assets at hindi belong sa tatlong different kinds of non-current assets, they all belong to other assets. Okay? So kaya nga ang tawag dyan, it serves as a catch-all for assets which are usually very much unique or hard to classify. So as a practical consideration, it is favorable to limit the usage of this account to encourage more distinctions. So usually, minsan, di ba, remember we have some rules or standards that the Philippines follow, di ba? Pero personally, yung mga ibang mga owner, they use their own unique, what do you call this, name for accounting title. So for example, kunwari sa inventory, pwedeng i-divide mo sa dry inventory or liquid inventory. So, depende na. Pero, ang pinaka-general nun is inventory pa rin. Parang ganon. Okay? So, kung meron tayong current assets and non-current assets, may katambal din yan sa liabilities. We also have current liabilities and non-current liabilities. So, just like assets, same lang siya ng concept. Ang pagkakaiba lang, ito yung mga kailangan mong or obligation mo. Okay? Mga kailangan mong bayaran. Okay? So, these are liabilities which are expected to be settled or paid out by the entity within 12 months. So, paying out does not necessarily mean paying through cash but can also include conversion or refinancing. Okay? So what are the current liabilities? These are accounts payable and notes payable. Accounts payable, notes payable are just the same sa accounts receivable and notes receivable. Okay? Oh, yung ingay nyo. Anyway, next is the accrued liabilities. So accrued liabilities are all other accounts which the company should pay. Okay, so arising from the normal course of business throughout the operating cycle, it is very much possible that the company has already received benefits from certain events, yet has still been unable to pay for it. In a way, accrued liabilities can also be considered the opposite of prepaid assets. So this is very much true as regard to unearned revenue, a form of an accrued liability. So usually ito yung, for example, sa salaries. Remember, di ba, kung meron tayong tauhan, usually yung mga empleyado natin, naka-render na sila ng services nila. Pero kapag di pa rin natin nabayaran yon, under na siya ng accrued liability. Kasi na-incurred na nila yung services, ay nagawa na nila yung trabaho nila, pero hindi pa natin sila nababayaran. Kaya meron tayong liability sa mga empleyado natin. Okay? Another is yung current portion of long-term debts. So these are long-term debts payable within the coming year. So some long-term debts due to their large principals usually have features that allow the borrower to pay on an installment basis so as to ease them the burden of heavy cash outflow from a single maturity date. And another is yung other payables. So whatever it is na payables na easily converted or easily be paid within a year, it falls to other payables. Okay? So this include common items such as dividends payable, interest payable, and usual as items such as payables arising from the lawsuits as long as they are payable within a year but do not enter into the other previous current classifications. They can be included in this catch-all classifications. Okay? Ano-ano ulit yung current liabilities? Accounts payable, notes payable,
Notes payable, accrued liabilities, current portion of long-term debts, and other payables.
So, I hope yung mga examples na nasabi ko dito, naka-note din doon. Kung ano ba yung mga accounting title na sinabi nga ni Ma'am, for example, sa accrued liabilities, ano-ano nga yun. So, dapat naka-note din siya. Okay? Sakit na lalamunan ko, class. Anyway, non-current assets is another, non-current liabilities is another type of liability. So just like the current non-current liability, non-current assets, these are those liabilities that is being paid more than a year. Okay? So by strict definition, of course, the entity expects to settle after more than a year or have the legal or contractual capacity to defer payment accordingly. So what are those non-current liabilities? Examples are bonds payable. So, ayan. Nandiyan na ang definition. Bonds payable are a form of long-term debt, often in huge sums contained in an agreement called as the bond and deture. So unlike notes payable, bonds payable have the stated interest rates which may differ from prevailing market interest rates, causing their fair values to change from time to time. So they are usually issued by the government, banks, and huge corporations seeking huge financing resources. Bonds which have principal that mature in a single date are called term bonds, take note of this one, and those that mature in multiple dates are called serial bonds. Okay? So, equity, hindi na tayo liability ha. Nasa ano na tayo, di ba? Asset, liabilities, nasa equity na tayo. Okay? Equity or owner's equity or stockholders equity. Okay? So, bakit may owner's equity, may stockholders equity, etc. Remember, we have different types of business organizations. So, partnership, corporation, and cooperative. So, ito po yung mga ginagamit na term. So, parang kung sole ka, nag-iisa ka, ang tawag sa'yo, owner. Kung partner kayo, partners. Pero kung corporation or cooperative kayo, stockholder. Ayan, mga ganon, diba? So, equity is the residual interest of the owners in the assets of a business. After considering all liabilities, it is equal to total assets minus total liabilities. So to illustrate the concept of equity, consider a sole proprietor who wants to start a business. So in order to fund the assets of the business, the sole proprietor obtains a loan from a bank in addition to investing his or her own money. So in this case, the business technically has two owners. Sino yon? The sole proprietor and the creditor bank, yung nagpautang. Kasi yung source of financing niya is niloan niya doon sa bangko. So these two entities have claims in the assets of the business. But because the sole proprietor has the obligation to eventually pay for the loan, the creditor bank has the greater claim on the business assets. So to determine how much really of the sole proprietor owns, he or she has to deduct the loan he or she has to pay for the or from the total assets of the business. So in the case of sole proprietorship and partnership, equity is also called owner's capital. So balance sheets of this entity have simple titles of the owner's equity components, usually the name of the sole proprietor. So for example, kung ako yung owner, ilalagay doon Karen Kate, Sibayan Capital. Pero kung sa Juan de la Cruz ang owner, Juan de la Cruz, capital. So a sole proprietorship has only one equity component, while partnership has many components as there are partner. So, of course, kung withdrawal yan, papalitan mo lang yung capital or capital ng withdrawal or drawing. Okay? These are some of the accounting titles being used. So in the case of corporation, it is more appropriate to use the term shareholders equity or stockholders equity. Kasi ang tawag doon sa mga may-ari ng korporasyon na yun is stockholder. Okay? Shareholders equity is more complex than owner's capital because it has many components which vary according to the complexity of the corporation's capital structure. So the shareholders equity section of the balance sheet usually has a common stock account, a preferred stock account, an additional paid-in capital account, and a retained earnings account. So in your accounting 1 and in your accounting 2 class, the only thing that will be discussed thoroughly from the journal entry up to the preparation of the financial statements and analyzing the result is as simple as sole proprietorship. Yung partnership, corporation, cooperative, sa higher nyo na yan, sa college na yan ituturo sa inyo. Kasi parang basic pa lang po ang tinuturo dito sa senior high. Okay? So meaning to say, wala dapat akong maririnig na merong partnership doon sa inyong marketing and entrepreneurship kasi nga, hindi nyo pa kayang gawin ang financial statement kung ito ay partnership, corporation, and cooperative kasi hindi pa nga na ituturo sa inyo. And mas komplikado ang preparation nun kasi you need to register it to the SEC. While it is easy to put up a business kung sole proprietorship ang types of business organization ang pipiliin ninyo. Whether it is a merchandising, manufacturing, or a service business as long as it should be a sole proprietorship. Okay, meaning to say you are the only owner. Yan. So for example, ito na yung example lang pero hindi natin gagawin kasi nga ano lang tayo, sole proprietorship lang. Yun lang ang nakalagay sa curriculum ninyo. FAB1, FABM1 and 2. So for example, Happy Donuts Corporation has 1,000 common shares and 1,000 preferred shares outstanding. So the par value of common shares and preferred shares are 5 and 10. Respectively, the stated interest rate of the preferred shares is 5%. If the company declared a 2,000 cash dividend, the common shareholders and the preferred shareholders each get 1,500 and 500 pesos respectively. Based on the following computation, sa preferred shareholders, 1,000 times 10 par value preferred shares times 5% equals 500 ang matatanggap to the preferred shareholders. But if you are common shareholders, 2,000 total cash dividend minus 500 to preferred shareholder equals 1,500 to common shareholders ang matatanggap nila. So, dyan pa lang malilito na kayo. Diba? Ayan. So, additional paid-in capital. So, pag sinabing additional paid-in capital, also called share premium. So, it is the excess over par value contributed by the company shareholder in a stock issue. It can either be from the issuance of common shares or preferred shares. For example, a company issues 5,000 common shares with a par value of 10 for 15 per share. The additional paid-in capital from this share issuance is 5 times 15 minus 10. Kaya nakuha yung 5. Per share for a total of 25,000. So additional paid-in capital arises because the selling value of stock is almost always greater than its par value. In other words, the par value is the minimum amount a share can be issued for. So pag sinabi namang retained earnings, ano ba ibig sabihin ng retained earnings? So usually yung mga word na to maririnig mo lang to if your form of business organization is a corporation and a cooperative. Okay, so retained earnings represents the accumulated net income from operations over several periods. It is a measure of how much the company earns since day one of its operation. So sometimes, yung mga investors or yung mga shareholders, they want to reap the benefits of their investment. So when a company gives back to its shareholders because it has been operating successfully over several periods, it declares dividends. So usually ako member kasi ako ng cooperative. So kung magandang kita ng cooperative sa canteen, so may binibigay sa aming dividend. So it will it will reduce retained earnings and to gain a better understanding of this retained earnings, it would be appropriate to discuss the increase and decrease in equity. Okay? So, pag increases in equity is when the result of revenues, gains, or capital contributions. So, kapag yung revenue na na-receive ng isang business ay nag-increase sa day-to-day operations niya. So meaning to say, yung amount of revenues for a period does not necessarily equate of the amount of actual cash received in the period of time. So revenues are only recognized when incurred and when an entity already incurs the related expenses. So huwag kayo malito dun sa word na incurred. Ibig sabihin kapag nagamit na or talagang na-earn mo talaga yung income nyo, doon mo palang ma-recognize kahit na nagbayad in advance, kunwari si customer, doon mo palang ma-recognize ang revenue mo if you have already rendered your services to that customer. Kung hindi mo pa po na rendered automatic, hindi mo pa dapat nire-recognize. Okay? So for example, if a magazine publishing company is given cash in advance, okay, to deliver magazines to its subscribers. So the company should not yet recognize revenues because it has not yet delivered. So once na na-release na yung or na-deliver na yung magazines, then sa kanyo pa lang ma-recognize yung revenue. Okay? So may question dito, but how should the company classify the cash it initially received if it should not be revenue? So in this case, the cash received is called deferred revenue. So yung nababanggit po na deferrals and referrals, so pag deferred revenue, it is also considered as a liability. Okay? Same as unearned and so deferred revenue. So very essential yung accruals and deferrals in the adjusting entry na later on mapapag-aralan nyo din. Okay? And take note of that. So revenues class can be classified as follows. We have operating revenue. So example, these are revenue that originate from main business operations, sales, service revenue, and etc. We also have what you call a non-operating revenue. So these are revenues that do not originate from main business operations and are as a result of some side activity. For example, interest revenue, rent revenue, or a business not engaged in the renting industry. So for example, kunwari, ganito lang, sige, bake shop. Example natin tayo ng industry natin. So ano ang masasabi kung operating revenue natin? So whatever it is na nag-earn ng income na directly related sa business ko. For example, sales ng tinapay. Yung for example, kapag may nagpaluto na babayaran ako dahil sa pagluluto ko. So, these are belong to the operating revenue. Pag sinabing non-operating revenues, for example, meron akong, may mga gamit kami, di ba? For example, nirentahan kong yung bakery ko kasi dun lang siya mag-bake. At dahil dyan, may rent revenue akong siningil sa kanya kasi nirentahan niya yung place ko or nirentahan niya yung mga equipment, ginamit niya, etc. Or for example, bigla akong nagbenta ng harina. Ayan. Na kumbaga, paggawa naman talaga ng tinapay dapat, yung finished product naman dapat ang binibenta ko. Pero kunwari lang na meron lang gustong bumili ng harina kasi nga kailangan niya kunwari sa school niya. So that is parang another revenue, extra revenue. Or for example, no, yung mga balde. 'Di ba kapag may-ari ka ng bakery, mayroon kang mga balde ng or sako ng harina na minsan binibili ng mga customers. So that is an extra revenue. It belongs to the non-operating revenue. Okay? Kung nasa office naman kayo, for example, 'di ba maraming mga coupon diyan, tapos 'di ba nakapag-print ka na back to back, tatapon mo na lang sana, but instead na tinapon mo, binenta mo sa kalakal, so nagka-earn ka pa ng another non-operating revenue. Okay? And halimbawa, yung pera mo, yung sales ng company mo, nilagay mo muna sa bangko and nag-earn siya ng interest income. That is another than operating revenue. So I hope nagigets nyo yung mga examples and you take note of that. Okay? So examples of revenue accounts are the following. Sales revenue. These are main source of revenue for business that sells products. Service revenue. Interest revenue. Dividends revenue. And of course, contributions revenue. Hindi ko na isa-isahin. Please read that. Okay? Nandiyan naman with examples pa yan. Okay? And not just memorize, understand class. Okay? Do you have any questions at the moment? Malapit na tayo mag-end. Chine-check ko lang. So time check, 2:33. Ayan. May questions ba at the moment? Nauunawaan po ba? Masyado ba akong mabilis? Once again, these are your coverage of your summative test 2. From accounting equation up to the end of the PowerPoint presentation na present natin. Okay? Yung i-access nyo is yung PowerPoint before the pandemic. May question po ba? Nandyan pa po ba kayo? Tulog na ba kayo?
Wala, ma'am.
Wala.
Wala po.
Malinaw. Malinaw ba yung discussion natin?
Yes
Yes
po,
po.
Yes
ma'am.
po.
Okay. Now let's proceed. So another revenue are gains. Okay. So gains are increases in equity as a result of non-recurring activities or the increase in value of investment. So non-recurring activities include the sale of company non-carry assets. So actually, hindi gains yung akin, loss yung akin. Hindi siya revenue, loss. Ayan, kasi kung meron kayong mga GCash class, try to click the G-Invest. That is when you can invest assets, intangible assets, wherein you can buy some stocks. Unfortunately, yung 1,000 ko, naging 800 na lang dahil sa mga nagaganap na gera. Ayan, so dati umabot ng, ano yon, hindi ko pa winidraw yung isang stocks ko eh. Ayan. So, gains kung meron kang kinita. Okay? Pero kung wala, loss na yon. Okay? Ayan. So, capital contributions are increase in equity as a result of transactions with owners. So, it can be in the form of cash and non-cash assets given by the owners for use in the business. So, ang example lang dito, for example, no, kapag nagdagdag ka as an owner ng capital in the form of cash, for example, nagsimula ka ng business mo, meron kang puhunan or capital na in-invest na 1,000 cash, 50,000 na equipment, etc. So habang nag-ooperate yung business mo, class, parang, mukhang medyo may extra pera ako ngayon, parang gusto kong dagdagan yung investment ko. So pwedeng cash ulit, in-invest na. Pwedeng equipment, halimbawa bumili siya ng bagong ref, bagong oven, for example, sa bakery. So, ang tawag dyan is capital contributions. Take note of the result, increases kapag nagdadagdag ka ng capital. Okay? So, it decreases naman the equity as a result of expenses, losses, and distribution to owners. So, expenses are the amounts consumed by the business to operate. So, they are the result of attempting to generate revenues. Just like revenues, they are the result of day-to-day operations and do not always equal the amount of cash used up in a given period. So, of course, bumababa ang equity natin, lalo na kung nadadagdagan yung ating expenses. Kasi nababawasan. Diba? Yan. So, may question ba dito? So kung wala, let's proceed. So how about expenses? So ano-ano yung mga accounting title under expenses, which is one of the 5 major accounts. These are the cost of goods sold. So usually ginagamit itong cost of goods sold kapag ang nature of business mo is manufacturing. Okay? Or merchandising. So cost of goods sold when inventory is sold, the cost of goods sold reflects what the company incurred to make the inventory sell in manufacturing companies or to buy them in merchandising companies. So utility expense, these are your cable, electricity, water. Ayan. So these are what you call utility. Okay? Hindi mo ilalagay yun ng Meralco expense. Basta kapag alam mong ilaw yan, tubig yan, cable yan, you'll just use the word utility expenses. Okay? Depreciation expense, these are usually the depreciated amount dun sa mga assets natin. Okay? Like building, nag-depreciate yan, equipment, nag-depreciate yan, etc. Okay? So office supplies expense, these are a result of using up office supplies. So usually consumables pag sinabi mong office supplies. So for example, no, kung nasa company ka, coupon is supplies. Kung meron tayong supplies, ang katandem niyan, supplies expense. Nakuha, kunwari, bumili ka, asset is a supplies. Example para ng another asset is supplies class. So for example, sa bakery namin, ang masasabi namin na supplies is yung mga flour. Yan. So meron kaming, it is divided into liquid and dry. Ayan. So yung liquid, yan yung mga oil, milk, mga ganon. So sa dried, ganon din. So supplies yan. Okay? So insurance, pag nagamit na yan, ang katandem niyan is supplies expense. So dito kasi nakalagay lang siya office supplies kasi yung industry niya is office. Okay? So pwedeng yan, bago hindi office supplies. Basta ang pinaka-general dyan is yung word na supplies expense. Kasi dito kaya ginamit niya na office supplies expense kasi ang nagamit is yung office supplies. Meaning to say stapler, bond paper. Pero usually hindi naman siguro madalang palitan ang stapler, di ba? Pero kapag nasira siya, of course, kailangan palitan. Usually, ano ba mga consumable? Of course, bond paper, yung ink, yan. Okay? Insurance expense naman, class. So, these are mga insurance benefits. Okay, na binabayaran ng mga mother ninyo. It can be life insurance. It can be insurance for your college. It can be for your security, for your health. Ganyan. Salaries expense, mga pambayad sa empleyado. Bad debt expense, so these are the accounts receivables the company will not be able to collect kasi nga, di sila nagbabayad ng utang eh. Diba? So interest expense, so ito naman yung kapag nangutang ka, lalo na kung nag-loan ka, tapos hindi mo nabayaran on time, so mag-i-incur siya ng interest expense. Pero kung ikaw yung may-ari ng company na inuutangan, meron ka namang interest income. Parang gano'n. Okay? Or, kunwari, sa bangko, nag-savings ka, interest income naman yung katandem nun. Yan. So, kanina sabi ko, di ba, losses. Ayan, dun po yung akin na losses. Okay? So, losses are the direct opposite of gains. So, nung nag-invest ako, unfortunately, losses siya. So, bago pa masagad, maubos yung invest ko, winidraw ko na, sinel ko na kaagad. Kesa naman sa mas bumaba pa yung value and buti na lang sinel ko at 800 plus kasi yung value ngayon nasa 700 plus na, sayang din yung 100, di ba? Anyway, they are decreases in equity as a result of non-recurring activities or decreases in value of assets. So, ang nangyari sa akin, it decreases the value of assets. So, nabili ko siya sa 1,000. Unfortunately, dahil bumaba yung value niya, nag-decrease siya. So, hindi ako nag-gain but instead, mayroon akong losses. Okay? And distribution to owners is assets given to owners, usually in cash for corporations. So, they are called dividends. So it can be viewed as reward for the stockholders for investing their money. So kung ang nature of business mo is or form of business mo is corporation and cooperative, kapag kumita, ang matatanggap ng mga members or ng stockholders ay tinatawag na dividends. Okay? Yan. Sabi nga, ito yung harvesting the fruits of your labor. Ayan. So they ideally should come from the retained earnings of the business because they represent the fruits of the company's hard work. If the dividends originate from some other equity account, they are called liquidating dividends. Take note of that. Kung galing sa liquidating account. Okay, liquidating dividends. Okay? Kung galing sa equity account. Kapag ano naman, sa treasury shares naman are technically also distribution to owners. However, instead of being viewed as reward like dividends, treasury shares are usually bought for an underlying motive. So treasury shares also reduce owner's equity. Take note also of that. Okay? Ano ba yung nakakapagpababa? So, take note of that. So if we add up all the revenues and gains and deduct all the losses and expenses, we get business net income for the period. Net income can also be called net earnings. So net income usually used in the sole proprietorship. Net earnings naman kapag corporations and cooperative. Okay, all the net incomes throughout years of the company's operation accumulate in the retained earnings account. So the transaction with owners, capital contribution and distribution to owners affect the shareholders' equity but never form part of net income. Nakakaapekto lang sila but they do not form part of the net income. Kasi in preparation of the net income, dalawa lang ang account na kailangan mo dyan. The revenue subtracted from the expenses. If higher ang revenue, meaning to say kapag revenue or income minus expenses, kapag positive ang naging result niyan, net income yan. Pero kapag naging negative yan, meaning to say your expenses is higher than your revenue, net loss ang tawag dyan. Okay? And that ends our discussion for today. So before we end, do you have any questions? Class? May katanungan po ba tayo? May comment? May violent reaction? May concern? Lahat ay sabihin nyo na. Kasi pag ano na, baka di ko na kayo magasagot. Okay? So this is your chance. May tanong po ba?
Ilan po pala yung summative 2 po?
Bukas din. Di ba tapos na ako nakapag-summative test 1? So parang ang kukuha lang bukas ng summative test 1, yung mga hindi nakakuha last time. Okay? So yung coverage ng last time, same lang din. Kaso babaguhin ko ang tanong, di ba? Pero same yung i-review yung topic. Kasi magiging unfair naman kung pareho, di ba? Possible na may ano na dyan, nag-leakage na, alam na kung anong tanong. Ayan. So for summative 2, lahat kayo mag-take ng summative test. It can be online or pwede pong pumunta sa school. Make sure lang na meron kayong vaccination card. Pero kung halimbawa wala, masama pakiramdam nyo, dami nyong dahilan, make it a point to find a way na makapag-summative test ka online kung hindi ka makakapunta ng face-to-face. Ang option ng face-to-face, yung walang-wala talagang internet, hirap na hirap talaga. Okay? Kasi as expected, online po ang modality ninyo, meaning to say you will try to find a way to submit your output on time kasi ayoko na po na magka-problema. So yung iba kay question pa, ma'am, bakit po ako 75? Remember, may deadline din kami sa DepEd class. Okay? And it is also unfair na regardless kasi hodang after ng inakumpleto mo lahat ng output. Unfair naman na meron akong binigyan ng 76, on time pa siya nagpasa, 76. Tapos ikaw, late na nga nagpasa, yes, kumpleto nga, bibigyan kita ng 80. So, di ba unfair naman yon? Kasi remember, meron ako kaming, nag-meeting kami with all the subject group head wherein, tawag doon, may binigyan kayo ng 2 weeks to comply. Kasi nakailang follow-up na kami. Parang ano na yun eh. Ultimatum na kumbaga. So may mga pinapunta pa akong parents. Ilan lang ang pumunta. Okay? So make sure na hindi po tayo magka-problema ng ganon. Kasi ang nakakalungkot lang kasi, kung sino pa yung matitino, yun ang laging present. Kung sino yung nangangailangan ng ano, nakakailang follow-up na ako, yun ang hindi pa rin umaattend. Okay? So kami po mga teacher class is taga-record lang ng grade ninyo. Nasa sa inyo yon kung gagawin nyo ang part ninyo. Okay? So meron pa po bang concern?
Ma'am, anong oras po yung summative?
Summative test is kung online, open po siya buong Friday. Okay? Basta gagawin nyo lang yun ng 25 minutes. So sabi ko nga, preferred ko pa rin ang Quizzy. So once na na-send na po sa GC ninyo yung link, anytime pwede na po kayong mag-start. Okay? So halimbawa, nag-start kayo, nagka-problema na naman, ayaw na naman mag-open. So automatically, may option na kayong pumuntahan ako sa school. Hanggang 3 p.m. po ako nandun. After 3 p.m., wala na ako doon. Okay? So may katanungan pa? Make sure lang nasabihan niyo sa akin ahead of time para mabigyan ko rin kayo or ma-printan ko rin kayo ng hard copy. Or you can just bring your laptop, doon kayo mag-online. I hope lang na may internet din doon. Hindi mag-run out. Yun lang naman ang possible na maging problem. Okay? So, isa-send ko po yung link, yung ibang mga further announcements sa GC. So, kilala niyo sa sarili niyo kung isa kayo sa hindi nakapag-summative test 1 last time. Diba? Ayan. So, again, yung announcement po ng ating president, especially the section, please lang class, kasi yun nga, ang hirap hanapin po nung Form 137 ninyo ng grade 10 kung hindi po nakalagay doon yung section ninyo. So, pinapa-edit na yun. Nasa GC lang yan. Mag-backread na kayo. Paki-fill up naman po. Pati yung updates kasi sinenda na naman kami ng summary ng reports. Okay? So, more or less nasa 17 ang ating 17 ang ating male and 51 ang ating female. And for today's attendance, I don't know kung may pumasok na baron. 35 lang po ang pumasok sa atin. So, officers, magtulungan na lang kayo na ma-monitor yung attendance ng klase natin. Hindi lang sa subject ko, pati na rin po sa ibang subject. I hope yung mga nabanggit ni Sir Jess na pangalan na hindi pa nakapagpasa sa kanya ay nakapagpasa na rin po. Very strict si Sir Jess. Okay, may particular lang. Iba ang rules ni Sir Jess, kay Sir Marvin, etc. Okay? So kapag nag-set siya ng time na yun ang quiz, yun talaga dapat. O di ba? Sa akin 24 hours kayo. O sa kanya, for example, ganitong oras lang. Okay? Basta anything na magka-problema kayo, PM nyo kaagad directly dun sa teacher concern. Okay? So may
Ma'am,
katanong. Yes, sino yun?
Paano po kapag hindi po nakapag-take ng quiz?
Kanino ba? Sa subject ko, Erolyn?
Ma'am.
Sa akin?
Opo. Kasi po hindi ko po ma-open yung link.
Oh, anong sabi ko sa GC? Oh, medyo nakulitan ako last time. Nakasabi ko na nga sa GC. Anong sinabi ko sa GC? Kung hindi talaga maka-open ang link, pupunta sa school. Kumuha ng summative test. Nakuha, Erlyn? Oh, hindi mo ma-access eh. 'Di ba? Oh, another question. May tanong pa? Kasi kung hindi ka makapag-online, no choice ka para makapag-quiz. Kundi, mag-hard copy ka. Diba? Kaya nga sabi namin, kung hirap na hirap ka talaga, di mag-shift ka sa digital. So, ganun din ang gagawin ng digital. I-access. Pero kahit digital kasi kailangan mo pa rin ng online eh. Pagkakaiba lang, hindi kayo laging, kumbaga, hindi kayo laging, yung ganito, no, during online class present. Modular kayo actually. Walang lecture doon. Teacher, magsasend ng module, sasagutan niya. Pero sa case ko kasi, yung ginagawa ko sa digital ko, since this is a very important subject, because this is your major subject, so yung recorded session natin, yun yung sinesend ko sa YouTube. They should find time. Dalawa lang yan. They find time to watch the video or option na yung PowerPoint presentation na nasinend ko sa G-class, yun ang babasahin nila, bahala silang mag-aral. Then yung isasend ko na quiz, sasagutan nila or kukunin nila. Kung internet ang problema, ipapasa nila sa school yung output nila. Ganun lang kasimple. Hindi po pwedeng sa simula ng semester ganun ang problema nyo, hanggang dulo ganun pa rin ang problema nyo. Anong paraan ang ginawa ninyo? So hindi ka maka-access, anong gagawin mo? Diba? So ganun lang. Any more questions and concerns? Meron pa po ba?
Ano niyo po ba yung sa pag-attendance po?
Ha?
Yung sa attendance po, isisend niyo po ba yung link?
Yes. Hihingin ko yan every end of the semester. Quarter pala. So, Officer Russell, kung pwedeng mag-assign sana although yung ibang teacher kasi meron ng talagang thoroughly, yung tipong bago mag-start ang klase, chine-check na yung, yan. Sa akin kasi, once na nag-start na ng klase, as much as possible, diretso na kaagad ako sa discussion kasi medyo mahaba-haba ang discussion natin. Mas gusto kong hindi masayang yung oras ko sa pag-check ng attendance. Although nag-i-screenshot naman ako, minsan nga nakakalimutan ko mag-screenshot. Then doon, binabalikan ko o sino ba yung present, ganyan. Okay? So sana ma-distribute. For example, klase natin sa ganito, sa MIL, kunwari. Sinong absent, baka kaya absent. Nang sa ganun class, ma-address na kaagad natin yung mga may problema na hindi nakaka-attend. Tapos ang lakas-lakas naman ng internet. Kasi nung nakausap ko yung mga magulang nyo, ang sagot sa akin, sabi naman sa akin, may online class sila. Tapos malaman-laman nila, walang output, blanco. Diba? So, paano nyo, yun? Sinabi ko rin sa parents na paki-monitor po yung mga anak ninyo kung during online class, online ba or not. Ayan. So, actually, after this, ipopost ko po sa GC yung mga screenshot ko. So, ibig sabihin, ito yung umattend sa klase ko. Out of 35, kalahati lang ang pumasok. Okay? May concerns pa? So, kung wala na, siguro hindi muna ako ngayon pwede ako mamaya mag-post ng performance task if magpo-post ako ng performance task class, laging ang deadline yon ay Monday. Okay? Monday lagi ang deadline ninyo. Para checking ko ng Tuesday. Okay? Ayan. So may tanong pa ba? So kung wala na, we will end this session and mag-review ng mga na-discuss ko today para ready bukas. Okay? May tanong pa? Wala na naman ako estudyante. Nandyan pa ba kayo? Mag-open nga kayo ng cam for the last time.
Yes.
Nandyan pa ba kayo? Tulog na o ano? Ayan. So, kaya
Nandito pa, ma'am.
hindi ko ino-open ng cam kasi lalo na yung ibang kaklase nyo, data lang po ang ang gamit. Madali kasing makaubos ng data pag naka-open ng cam. Okay? So, yun lang. Goodbye, class. And see you next week or Friday kung mag-face-to-face quiz kayo. Okay. Bye.
Bye,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Bye.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye, ma'am.